The blade came out of the dark before the sound did. Anya Sokolov heard the scrape of a shoe on the studio floor and turned, one hand still on the bar, and the man was already close hood up, breath fogging in the unheated room, something bright and thin catching the red glow of the exit sign. The building was supposed to be empty. It was past midnight, the company gone home hours ago, and she had stayed the way she always stayed, alone, running the same 8 bars of the second act until her body stopped arguing with her about them. Now there was a stranger between her and the door, and the only light was the low red hum of the exit sign, and she could not remember how to scream. "You don't run," the man said, almost gently, as if he'd rehearsed it. "That's what I like about you. You never run." She understood, in that flooding, ice water instant, that he had watched her before, that the letters slid under the studio door, the flowers with no card, the feeling on the back of her neck for 6 weeks that she had told herself was exhaustion, all of it had been times this. A face finally attached to the dread. He moved, and then the dark itself seemed to move with him. She never saw where the second man came from. One moment, the stranger was lunging, and the next he was folded to the floor with a sound like a door slamming, and a tall shape stood over him in a long dark coat, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, and none of it belonged to fear. He did something to the stranger's wrist. The blade skittered away across the sprung floor and stopped at the base of the mirror. And in that mirror, Anya saw the whole room doubled herself, pressed to the bare, the hooded man crumpling, and the tall stranger's face turning, at last, toward her. He was not looking at the man he'd just put down. He was looking at her. Dark eyes, a stillness in them that was worse than rage, a jaw cut like something carved rather than born. Rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided to keep alive. And Anya, who had spent her whole life being watched by audiences, by directors, by rivals, had never in her life been seen times like that. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who had never once had to raise it. Her own voice cracked. "Who are you?" He crouched, picked up the fallen knife between 2 fingers, examined it without interest, and let it drop into his coat pocket. On the floor, the hooded man groaned and did not get up. "Someone who should have been faster," the stranger said. Then quieter, almost to himself, "I'm sorry it got this close." This close. As if he had been measuring the distance all along. 2 more men came through the studio doors then, silent, in dark clothes, and they lifted the groaning stranger between them without a word from anyone. They didn't call the police. They didn't ask her a single question. They simply removed the threat from her world the way a surgeon removes something diseased. And she realized with a slow, spreading horror that whoever these people were, this was not chaos to them. This was procedure. The tall man was still watching her. "Get your coat," he said. "You're not staying here tonight." His name, she would learn, was Emil Draghi. And by morning she understood that everyone in the city knew it, and no one said it out loud. He didn't take her to a police station. He took her, through rain that had started to thicken towards snow, in a black car with tinted glass, to a building she had walked past 1,000 times without ever looking up. And when the elevator opened directly into a penthouse of dark stone and colder light, and she crossed to the tall windows to steady herself, she stopped breathing, because she knew this view. She was looking down and across the street at the lit windows of her own studio, the bar, the mirrors, the little corner where she left her water bottle. From here, in the dark, a person could stand at this glass and see everything. She turned around very slowly. "You," she said, the penthouse across from the studio. "I thought it was empty." "I know," he said. For how long? He didn't lie to her. She would come to understand, much later, that he never once lied to her, and that this was its own kind of terrifying, because a man who never bothers to lie is a man who has decided you'll stay, whether you like the truth or not. "A year," Emil said. The word landed in the center of her chest and detonated slowly. A year. Every late night, every private rehearsal she'd believed was hers alone. The raw ones. The ones where she cried at the bar when a role she'd bled for went to someone else. The ones where she danced badly and swore and started again he had times watched. A stranger. A man whose men carried people out of rooms without being told. She should have been afraid. She was afraid. But underneath the fear, in a place she refused to look at directly, something turned over and would not lie still. "That's obscene," she said, and her voice shook, and she made it stop. Do you understand that's a violation? You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "Then why?" For the first time, something crossed his face. Not much. A flicker, quickly shuttered, like a light seen through a closing door. He looked at her, and for a moment the terrible stillness in him thinned, and she saw something underneath it that she had no name for, and would spend weeks trying to name. "Because someone should," he said, and that was all he would give her. He did not touch her. That was the first thing she noticed, and could not stop noticing over the days that followed, when it became clear she was not going home, not until the man from the studio talked and the men behind him were accounted for, and Emil Draghi was satisfied that the city was safe for one specific woman. He gave her the guest wing, 3 rooms with their own door that locked from the inside, and he made sure she saw that it locked from the inside. He had her things brought from her apartment, folded by someone with unsettling care. He learned that she took her coffee black and bitter, and it appeared that way without her asking. Once, and never wrong again. And he kept a distance from her body like it was a live wire. She caught it in small things. The way he'd step back to let her pass through a doorway rather than turn sideways and risk brushing her. The wailed! When he handed her a folder of the security arrangements he expected her to follow. He set it on the table between them, rather than into her hand. Once, on the second night, she stumbled coming off the practice floor he'd had installed for her times. He had installed a floor times, and his hand shot out to catch her, fast as the night in the studio, and then stopped, hovered, an inch from her arm. She could feel the warmth of his palm across that inch. He let her find her own balance and lowered his hand and said nothing, and his jaw was tight, and she understood that the restraint cost him something. It should have made her feel safer. It made her feel like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. "You don't have to look at me like I'm a bomb," she told him. The third night, over dinner she hadn't wanted and ate anyway. Emil considered her across the table. Candlelight moved on the planes of his face. Outside, the snow had come in earnest, falling past the glass in long, slow sheets, and the city below was reduced to smeared gold. "I look at you," he said slowly, "like something I don't get to touch." The fork went still in her hand. "Why not?" she said, before she could decide whether she wanted to know. "Because I decided that a long time ago." He set down his glass. "Eat, Anya. You danced 6 hours today." I watched. There it was again, that casual, devastating times. I watched times, and this time it did not feel like a violation. This time it felt, God help her, like being held. The man from the studio talked on the 4th day. Emil did not tell her what was said, but she felt the change in the penthouse the way you feel a pressure drop before a storm. The men moved differently, faster. The quiet arguments behind closed doors, a phone that rang in the middle of the night and was answered on the first ring. She woke to find Emil standing at the great windows in the dark, not looking at her studio for once, looking at nothing. One hand curled loose at his side, and the other braced against the glass, and the line of his shoulders was the line of a man carrying something enormous alone. She should have gone back to bed. Instead, she crossed the cold floor in bare feet and stood beside him, close enough that their reflections overlapped in the black glass. "It's not a stalker," she said. "Is it? Not just a stalker?" "No. Tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. Snow ticked against the window. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost tender, which frightened her more than anything. "There are men in my world," he said, "who understand that I cannot be hurt through fear. I have nothing left they can threaten. No wife, no child, no God. They tried, over the years, and they learned there was nothing to hold on to." He turned his head, and his eyes found hers in the reflection. And then, somehow, one of them found the one thing I would burn the world to keep breathing. And they aimed at it. The one thing. She heard what he wasn't saying, and her heart began to pound so hard she was certain he could hear it in the silence. "Me," she whispered. "I'm the thing." "You were the thing before I ever decided to let myself want it," Emil said, and his control finally slipped, just at the edges, just enough. "That's the part you don't understand yet. I didn't build this to trap you. I built it because I found out you existed. and I could not go back to a world where I did nothing while someone reached for you. You don't times no times me, she said again, but it came out weaker this time, because it was starting not to be true. I know, he said, that when you fall in rehearsal, you get up before the pain finishes. I know you learned the male variation in the third act because you thought the choreography was wrong and you wanted to prove it to yourself, alone, at 2 a.m, where no one could tell you no. I know you cried the night they gave Odette to the director's favorite, and then you wiped your face and danced it better than she ever will and told no one. He let that sit. I've had a year of the truest version of you there is, the one no one performs for. Don't tell me I don't know you. The snow fell. Their reflections stood too close in the glass. That's not the same as knowing me, she said, but her hand had found the cold window an inch from his, and neither of them moved it away. She found the room by accident. Emil was gone for the day, a meeting. One of the low, quiet arguments that had migrated out of the penthouse and into the city, and she'd gone looking for the practice floor and opened the wrong door, and the light came on automatically, and she stood on the threshold of a small dark room and could not make herself go in. It was not what the movies had taught her to expect. There were no walls of frantic photographs, no red string, no shrine. It was worse, because it was gentle. There was a single shelf. On it, in careful order, were the small cast-off artifacts of her life. A program from a recital 3 years ago, when she'd been in the corps, and her name was in the smallest print. A pair of point shoes she'd thrown in the studio trash the night she nearly quit clean now. Mended. The ribbons pressed. A newspaper clipping. A bad review that had gutted her. The critic's cruelest line underlined, not in mockery, but circled the way you'd mark a thing you meant to answer for later. And a photograph. Just one. Not stolen through a long lens, stunning the share, toward the share, the share and a faded church interior candles. A girl of maybe 16, half turned toward the camera with a look of open, unguarded fear on her face. Anya's own face. She picked it up with hands that had gone numb. She did not remember the photograph being taken, but she remembered the church. God. She remembered the church, a night she had spent a decade trying to forget, folded away in the part of her that held the things she survived. Behind her, the elevator opened. She turned with the photograph in her hand, and Emil stood in the doorway of the wing, snow melting on his coat, and he saw what she was holding, and every ounce of his careful distance fell away at once. You said you didn't know me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. You lied about that. Just that once. I've never lied to you. Then explain this. She held up the photograph, the girl, the church, the fear. Explain how you have times this. He crossed the room slowly. He did not reach for the photograph. He stopped a careful distance away. And for the first time since the studio, since the knife, she watched the feared man in front of her be afraid. I was 19, Emil said. He told her, the way you tell someone a thing you've kept so long it's grown into you. He'd been 19 and running. A deal his father sent him to make had been an ambush his father either failed to see or intended, and he'd taken 2 bullets getting out, and he'd gone to ground in the only unlocked door on a freezing street, an old church, empty, or so he'd thought, its candles burning low. He'd meant to lie down behind the last pew and wait to see whether he'd die or not. Those were the only 2 options he'd allowed himself, and a girl had found him. 16, maybe. She'd come in the side door out of the cold, her dance bag on her shoulder, and she'd seen a bleeding stranger dying on the stone floor of a church at night, and she had not run. That was the thing he could never afterward account for. Every rule of the world she lived in said run, call someone, do anything but what she did, which was drop to her knees beside a dangerous bleeding man twice her size, and press her own scarf against the wound and stay. You told me your mother was a nurse, Emil said. You knew what to do. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I'd done. You asked if it hurt. His voice was steady only because he was making it. No one had asked me that in years. No one asked me that again for a long, long time. You kept me alive until I could stand. And then you were terrified. I could see you were terrified. And you helped me to the door anyway. And before I went, you asked me to promise I'd go to a real doctor, like I owed you that. Like my life was a thing you'd invested in and expected me to protect. Anya's eyes had filled. She hadn't decided to let them. I never knew your name, he said. For years, I looked and I couldn't find you. And I told myself it was better, that a girl like that should never be near a man like me twice. And then last winter I bought this penthouse for a reason that had nothing to do with anything. And I stood at that window with a drink I didn't want, and across the street a woman was dancing alone in an empty studio at 2 in the morning. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked, and she got knocked down by a lift that went wrong. And she got up before the pain finished. And I knew. Before she turned around, I knew. The photograph trembled in her hand. I took that in the church, he said, nodding at it. Before I left, I don't know why, so I'd have proof, maybe, that someone in the world had once looked at me and decided I was worth the trouble. His eyes came up to hers, and everything he'd been holding behind that stillness was there now, unguarded, terrible, and hers. You saved my life once, Anya, when I was nothing and you had no reason to. I have spent a year trying to be the man who's finally allowed to do it back. The room was very quiet. The snow fell past the window in the next room, silent behind the glass. You could have just told me, she said, through tears now, angry and unraveling both, in the studio. That night, you could have said, I'm the boy from the church, and you'd have had to carry it, Emil said gently. The debt, the weight of a man like me knowing your name. I wanted to keep you clean of it. I wanted to guard you and never let you see the guard. His jaw tightened. I did it wrong. I know I did it wrong. But don't tell me it wasn't love, because I don't have another word for a year of my life. And that was the moment, not the knife, not the penthouse, not the shelf that Anya Sokolov understood she was not going to walk out of this and be free of him, because she no longer wanted to be. She crossed the distance he wouldn't. She put her hand flat against his chest, over the old scar she now knew was there, and she felt his heart going like a hunted thing under her palm. And she watched the most feared man in the city close his eyes against her touch like a man kneeling in that church again. You still haven't kept your promise, she said, unsteady. You said you'd see a real doctor. You never told me if you did. A sound left him that was almost a laugh and almost broke. I did, he said. I've kept every promise I ever made you, even the ones you don't remember making me make. He did not kiss her. She realized, dizzily, that he was still waiting, that even now, with her hand on his heart, he would wait until the world ended before he took a single thing she didn't freely hand him. So she handed it to him. She rose onto the balls of her feet, the way she'd risen 10,000 times for other reasons, and she kissed the corner of his mouth, and she felt the enormous, careful stillness of him shatter all at once, felt his arms come around her at last like something that had been held back at the top of a dam for a year, and the snow fell, and the city glittered cold and far below, and for one suspended moment there was no danger anywhere in the world. It didn't last. It was never going to last. The danger, when it came for the second time, came wearing a face Emil knew. She was in the penthouse alone. No, not alone. Never truly alone. There were always his men in the outer rooms when the private elevator that only Emil used opened without warning, and a man stepped out who was not Emil, and was, unmistakably, made of the same material. He was younger, handsome in a colder, sharper way. All the edges Emil had sanded off himself left deliberately keen. He wore his coat like a costume, and he smiled at her with Emil's mouth, and none of Emil's stillness. And Anya's whole body understood danger before her mind caught up. So, the man said, walking a slow circle around her, taking her in. The ballerina, the great secret, the soft spot. He tilted his head. I have to say, sister, I expected more. I expected, I don't know. Armor. Who are you? She kept her voice level. She'd learned that from Emil. Tomas. He said it like it should mean something, and when it clearly meant nothing to her, his smile thinned, and something ugly moved underneath it. Ah, he didn't tell you about me. Of course he didn't. Emil edits. Emil curates. Emil decides which parts of the truth you're allowed to carry. Isn't that right? He's protecting you from me the way he protects you from everything, by keeping you stupid. His men were in the room now. 2 of them. Emil's men, she realized with a lurch, were not. He built all this, Tomas went on, gesturing at the penthouse, the windows, the view of her studio, for you. Do you understand what that means? In our world? He gave a target a name. He took the one man no one could reach, and he handed the whole city a key. Me. He stopped in front of her. I've wanted his chair for a long time. I could never find the crack in him, and then he made you. A cold, delighted contempt. You're not the thing he loves, Ballerina. You're the thing that finally makes him times killable. Where is he? She said. Coming, Tomas said pleasantly. Fast, I'd imagine. That's the whole point. You're the letter I've written him. I just need him to open it. And then he took her arm, the first man to touch her in that penthouse in weeks, and Anya, who had spent her whole life being lifted and carried by men on cue, did the one thing none of them ever expected of a dancer. She turned it into a weapon. She dropped her weight the way you drop it in a fall you've rehearsed 1,000 times, went boneless, and then exploded, and her heel came up into his knee with the full trained force of a body that could hold an arabesque for a minute at a time. He buckled. She was already moving. Not toward the elevator, they'd have that, but toward the one door she knew locked from the inside. The guest wing. He made sure I saw it locked, and she got through it and through the bolt half a second before a body hit it from the other side. Then she did the only thing left to do. She went to the window. She opened it to the freezing night and the 50-story fall and the snow. And across the street, in the lit studio she'd danced in alone for years. Believing she was unwatched, she reached up and killed the lights off. On, off the old distress signal, the thing you learn as a child and never think you'll use. Screaming into the dark in the only language she and the man across the street had ever really shared. Look up. Look up. I'm here. Come. Emil was already coming. He'd known the moment his men went dark. He'd known, with the cold, total certainty that had kept him alive for 2 decades. Exactly who and exactly why. And there was a part of him, the part he'd spent a year trying to kill for her sake, that had been waiting for this since the night in the studio. Because men like Emil did not get to keep soft things. And the world always came, eventually, to collect. He saw the studio lights flare and die across the dark as his car reached the block. Off, on, off. Her. Alive. Signaling. And something in his chest that had been clenched for an hour came loose into a rage so clean and so quiet it felt like peace. He did not go up the way Tomas expected. He came up the way only he knew. Through the service corps. Through a door his brother didn't know existed because Emil had never trusted his brother with a single true thing, and he came into his own home like weather. The first 2 men never understood what happened. The third saw enough to be afraid before it stopped mattering. And then Emil was standing in the wreck of his own living room, snow blowing in through the open window of the guest wing, his coat dark and wet at the shoulder where he'd been hit and hadn't noticed, and across the room stood his half-brother with a gun in his hand, and behind a locked door his heart was pounding. He could hear her. Alive, alive, and Tomas smiled at him the way he'd smiled since they were children. There he is, Tomas said. The great Emil, bleeding, in front of a woman. I honestly didn't think I'd live to see it. Let her go, Emil said. Level, almost gentle. This is you and me. It was always going to be you and me. Leave her out and I'll give you the meeting you've wanted for 10 years. My word, your time's word. Tomas laughed, and it cracked. There was something under the contempt Emil saw. Something old and starved. The thing that had made his brother into this. You know what I want? I want you to feel it. Once, the thing you made everyone else in this family feel our whole lives. To watch the one thing you can't live without get taken while you stand there and can't stop it. He raised the gun toward the locked door. I want you to lose. The next 3 seconds contained the whole of Emil Draghi's soul. He did not go for his own weapon. There wasn't time, and he knew it. He crossed the room, he crossed it the way she crossed a stage. All his weight and speed pouring into one impossible line, and he put his own body between the gun and the door, between the bullet and the woman behind it. And the shot went into him instead of into the wood, and the impact turned him and dropped him against the door she was hiding behind. And he heard her scream his name through it, muffled, unbearable, and he thought, with the last clear thought before the pain took the top of his mind, that this was fair, that a life she'd once saved was hers to lose, that he was, finally, allowed. He was still conscious when his own men, the real ones, the ones Tomas had never been able to buy, the ones Emil kept precisely for the night, the inside came apart, poured through the elevator he'd left open on purpose. Because Emil had not come alone. Emil had never once in his life come anywhere alone. And the only person who'd believed otherwise was the brother who'd never understood him. It ended fast after that. It ended the way these things end. And Anya, on the other side of the door with her hands pressed to the wood and blood seeping under it toward her bare feet, heard it end and did not care who won. She threw back the bolt, and she found the most feared man in the city on the floor of his own home, gray-faced, soaked red, looking up at her with those dark, still eyes gone soft and unfocused. And when she dropped to her knees beside him and pressed both hands to the wound the way she'd pressed a scarf to a stranger a lifetime ago, he smiled. He actually smiled. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. Blood on his lips. "Shut up," she said, weeping, pressing harder. "Shut up. Shut up. You don't get to do this. You promised promised times me. You'd see a real doctor. Kept it," he breathed. "I'll keep it again. Anya." His hand came up, and this time it did not stop an inch away. This time it found her face and left a print of his own blood on her cheek, and neither of them cared. "Look at me. You did it right. Church again. You did it right. Don't you dare," she said. "Don't you dare make me the girl who saved you twice and lost you anyway. Stay. Stay. That's not a request." And Emil Draghi, who took orders from no one, who had built an empire on never once needing another living soul, held on because she told him to. He didn't die. It was a very long night, and a longer week. In a private room he owned in a hospital he half-owned, and there were hours the doctors would not meet her eyes, and there was one dawn she stood at the window watching the snow stop, and made a bargain with a god she'd stopped believing in somewhere around 16, on the floor of a church, with a bleeding boy's head in her lap. But he didn't die. She was there when he woke, which is to say she had not left, which is to say the nurses had given up asking her to. She was asleep in the chair with her hand inside his when his fingers moved, and she came awake all at once the way dancers do, and his eyes were open and clear and fixed on her face with the same expression they'd worn across a dark studio a lifetime ago, like something he'd already decided to keep alive. "You stayed," he said. His voice was a ruin. It was the best thing she'd ever heard. "You're going to have to stop making me do that," she said, and her voice broke, and she pressed his knuckles to her mouth. "Saving your life. It's becoming a whole thing." The corner of his mouth moved. He looked, in that moment, younger than she'd ever seen him, not the boss, not the stillness, not the man the city whispered about, just a person who had spent his whole life braced for the collection, and was, against all odds, still here. "Tomas?" he asked. Something in her face answered before she could. His eyes closed briefly, and she understood that even now, even after everything, the loss of a brother who'd tried to kill her was a loss to him, and she loved him more for the grief than she'd have loved him for hate. "You could have let him shoot the door," she said quietly. "You could have gone for your gun. You'd have lived clean. Instead, I got to keep you." His fingers tightened on hers, weak but sure. "There was never a version where I chose the other thing. Anya, I want you to understand that. Not as a debt, not as a church, not as a year at a window. If it comes for you again, and in my life, it comes, I will always be the thing between it and you. That's not the wound talking." His eyes held hers. "That's just what I am now. You made me it. In a church, when I was 19, you just took a long time to come collect." Outside the snow had stopped, and the city was white and clean and briefly, blessedly quiet. Down in the world somewhere his empire waited, and rivals recalculated, and the danger that trailed men like Emil Draghi coiled and slept and would wake again. She knew that. She was not a woman who lied to herself. She had never been that woman, not even at 16 with a stranger's blood on her scarf. She knew exactly what she was choosing. "Then I'm not leaving," Anya said. "I want to be very clear about that, since you're a man who likes things spelled out. I'm not the debt you're repaying, and I'm not the soft spot they aim at. I'm the woman who's staying. There's a difference, and you're going to learn it, and it's going to take you the rest of your life." Emil Draghi looked at her for a long moment, and the terrible stillness that had frightened her the first night was gone, and what was underneath it, what had always been underneath it, since a church, since candles, since a girl who asked a dying stranger if it hurt, was simply, nakedly, hers. "The rest of my life," he said, like a man accepting a sentence he'd prayed for. "All right?" Months later, spring in the city, the snow long gone, the river loud with melt. Anya danced Odette on opening night to a house that came to its feet, and in the dark of the third tier, in a box that no one else was permitted to occupy, a man in a long dark coat watched her the way he'd watched her for a year through a rain-streaked window, alone, unhurried, with the whole world locked outside the door. Except she wasn't unwatched anymore, and she wasn't alone, and she knew he was there. At the very top of the second act, in the held breath before the music broke open, she did something she had never once done in her life. She stopped, in point, in the center of the stage, in the full white light, and she turned her face up and to the left, to the dark box in the third tier, to the man in it. And for one impossible heartbeat, in front of 2,000 strangers, the prima ballerina looked at the most feared man in the city and let him see her, see him. Then she turned, and the music broke, and she danced. And in the dark, where no one could tell him no, Emil Draghi pressed one hand flat against the railing, the way he'd once pressed it to cold glass, and let himself, at last, be found. The city has 100 stories about the man in the box. This is the only true one. And somewhere across town, tonight, in a penthouse that used to be empty, a light is on.